Good evening, and welcome back to Lunar History. Tonight, we're taking a journey into the stars, but not in the way you might expect. We're not talking about horoscopes, lucky numbers, or predictions for your future. Instead, we're diving into the strange, twisted, and often forgotten myths that gave birth to the zodiac signs themselves. These stories are far more fascinating, and sometimes darker than the polished symbols you see in modern astrology. Imagine looking up at the night sky thousands of years ago. There are no city lights, no distractions, only the vast black canvas above and the stars glittering like scattered jewels. To the ancients, those stars were not random. They were memory, warning, and hope. Each constellation told a story of heroes who rose and fell, of gods who meddled in human lives, of creatures so strange and tragic that they had to be immortalized in the heavens. What we call the Zodiac today, the ring of 12 constellations along the path of the sun, was once a living storybook, an eternal anthology of human experience. And the truth is, these myths weren't gentle bedtime tales. They were about courage and cruelty, betrayal and sacrifice, beginnings born from endings. In short, they were about the messy, unpredictable drama of life itself. Written not on scrolls or stone, but on the very fabric of the sky. Over the course of this video, we'll walk through each of the 12 zodiac signs Aries to Pisces and uncover the real myths behind them. You'll meet a golden ram that carried children to safety, but at a terrible cost, a beautiful princess carried away by a bull that was no bull at all. Inseparable twins who defied death itself, and a crab so small it seemed insignificant, yet loyal enough to earn a place among the stars. These myths don't just explain why the constellations exist. They also carry lessons about bravery, loyalty, justice, endurance, and the human search for meaning in a world ruled by forces larger than ourselves. As you listen, I want you to imagine yourself standing where those ancient storytellers once stood, in a quiet hilltop or a windswept shore, gazing up at the same stars they saw. The constellations haven't changed. The myths still whisper. And tonight, you'll hear them again. Before we begin, if you love exploring history's hidden corners, mythologies, strangest tales, or simply enjoy winding down with stories that blend wonder with wisdom, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a journey like this one. Your support helps us keep bringing these stories to life, stories that are too strange to be forgotten and too human to be ignored. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Let your mind drift upward to the sky that has always been watching us. The Zodiac is waiting, and its stories are far more tangled, tragic, and unforgettable than you've ever imagined. Let us step into the story, not as if we are opening a textbook or glancing at a horoscope column, but as though we are entering a grand hall, lit only by the glow of distant constellations, where each flickering star is a doorway into another tale, another voice from the past, another fragment of the imagination that has shaped human history. The Zodiac, as most of us know it today, is often reduced to personality traits, predictions for the week ahead, or neat symbols used to decorate jewelry. But when we peel back those modern layers and listen to what the ancients truly believed, we find a tapestry of myths that are as haunting as they are beautiful. A network of stories that carried warnings and hopes, that recorded triumphs and disasters, that gave meaning to the mysteries of life and death by fixing them forever in the heavens. The video you are about to experience is not simply a retelling of the Zodiac as you have seen it in glossy magazines. It is a journey backward through centuries of imagination and belief, to the point where the constellations themselves became a library written in light, each one a permanent reminder of the complicated relationship between humanity and the divine. What makes these myths so compelling is not their simplicity, but rather their depth and strangeness. For every sign of the Zodiac, whether it appears as a mighty animal, a humble creature, or even a pair of scales, hides a tale of struggle, transformation, and sacrifice. Aries is not merely the ram of determination and energy that modern astrology praises, but a golden beast with wings that carried children away from a murderous fate, only to leave behind sorrow and loss. Taurus is not simply a symbol of strength and fertility. but a reminder of the day Zeus himself, disguised as a magnificent bull, and swept Europa across the sea, changing her life forever. Gemini is more than twins who laugh together under the same sign. It is a story of brothers who refuse to be parted by death, of immortality willingly shared so that companionship could outlast the grave. Cancer, which today might be spoken of, in terms of sensitivity and emotion, began as a crab crushed beneath the heel of Heracles, honored not for victory, but for loyalty in the face of certain defeat. Leo roared into being not as a regal emblem of confidence, but as a monstrous lion whose hide no blade could pierce, brought down only by the brute strength and unyielding patience of a hero who would come to wear its skin. Virgo, whose image we now see as a serene maiden, first embodied Astrea, the last immortal to walk among humans, who departed in sorrow when justice was forgotten and cruelty replaced kindness. Libra, the scales, appears as a simple symbol of fairness, yet in its origin it was both a practical and sacred reminder to keep measures true to weigh grain and coin honestly, to balance light and dark as the seasons shifted from summer into autumn. As the wheel of the zodiac turns, the stories continue. Scorpio's sting marks the downfall of a great hunter whose pride grew too dangerous. Sagittarius carries the memory of the centaur torn between wisdom and wildness. Capricorn tells of a sea-goat that fled in fear, yet still earned its place in the heavens. Aquarius pours his endless water, as both gift and burden tied to the tale of a youth taken by the gods to serve forever. Pisces swims forever in twin flight, bound together as they escaped a threat too terrible to face alone. When gathered together, these 12 constellations are not gentle ornaments, but a cosmic anthology of survival, devotion, betrayal, and transformation, each one capturing the very human attempt to explain why the world is filled with both wonder and sorrow, and why the sky above us holds so many silent witnesses to our struggles. To those who first tilted their heads back beneath an ancient sky, the constellations were never idle decorations, nor harmless dots scattered without purpose, but rather living symbols, immense and unshakable, carrying within them the weight of memory and the echo of voices that would otherwise have been lost to time. And so every cluster of stars became a story etched upon the heavens, not because people thought them beautiful alone, but because they believed the universe itself was speaking to them in a language of light and shadow. Imagine the silence of a hillside at night, the cool air pressing against the skin, the flicker of a small fire dying down to embers, and above it all, the slow, unblinking sweep of the stars. In that vast darkness, men and women did not merely see random arrangements, but visions of justice, warnings of pride, tales of love, both loyal and destructive, omens of survival and loss, lessons that no parchment or temple could preserve so permanently. To an ancient farmer waiting for the rains, the rising of a certain constellation was more than an astronomical event. It was a signal that life could return to the soil, that seeds could be trusted to grow. To a sailor venturing across an uncertain sea, the sight of familiar stars was not just reassurance of direction, but a promise that the gods themselves might guide his vessel to safety. To the poets and priests who wove myths into song, the constellations stood as reminders that every human triumph and every human tragedy could be carried upward, preserved forever beyond the reach of decay. In this way, the night sky became both mirror and map, a mirror of human fears and desires, and a map by which the ancients navigated not only their ships and seasons, but also their understanding of what it meant to live, to lose, to hope, and to endure. Thus, when we speak of the zodiac as a circle of 12 signs, we are not only tracing the path of the sun across the heavens, but also stepping into a library without walls, where each chapter is a constellation that tells a story of transformation, sacrifice, devotion, or warning. To the ancients, stars were never silent. They spoke in the language of myth, in symbols that carried the force of memory, in patterns that gave structure to chaos. And when we follow their gaze and retell these myths, we are not merely indulging in superstition, but touching the very foundation of how human beings once understood themselves in relation to the universe through stories so powerful that they were written not in ink or carved into stone, but fixed forever in the luminous script of the night sky. long before the Greeks carved their myths into marble and set their gods upon Olympus. The idea of the zodiac had already taken root in a land where river valleys flooded and receded with such precision that entire civilizations learned to measure time by the heavens. For it was in ancient Babylon that the first threads of this great cosmic circle were drawn, not as idle entertainment, but as a serious attempt to understand the rhythm of the world. To the priests who climbed their ziggurats and gazed into the endless black above, the constellations were both calendar and compass, markers by which the shifting seasons, the swelling floods, and the cycles of planting and harvest could be foretold. They observed the sun's steady passage along a narrow band of stars, the path we now call the ecliptic, and they gave names to the figures they imagined there, names that carried symbolic weight and practical meaning. It was from this Babylonian heritage that the idea of 12 stations along the sun's path emerged, each one bound to both myth and measurement, a framework that allowed mortals to weave order out of the chaos of the sky. When these ideas drifted westward across the seas and mountains into Greece, they did not remain in the sober language of observation alone, for the Greeks were never content simply to record what they saw. Instead, they clothed the constellations in narrative, filling the sky with the tangled intrigues of their gods and heroes. What had once been a system for marking the turning of the year became in Greek hands a stage where Zeus pursued his passions in the form of a shining bowl, where loyal twins bargained with immortality itself to remain together, where a crab crushed underfoot was still rewarded with eternal remembrance. The Greeks wove tragedy and triumph, betrayal and salvation, into the quiet Babylonian framework, transforming a celestial calendar into something at once mythic and moral, a scrapbook of the divine written across the heavens. In this way, the zodiac became more than a tool for reckoning time. It became a gallery of stories that reflected not only the order of the cosmos, but also the unruly drama of the human heart. To look upon the constellations was no longer to see mere agricultural markers or navigational aids, but to witness the struggles of heroes, the schemes of gods, and the enduring reminder that even the smallest creature, even the briefest gesture of loyalty or courage, might be immortalized in the eternal stage of the sky. What becomes striking, once you begin to peel away the polished surface of these constellations, is how rarely they were created to honor peace or serenity. For the sky was not reserved for quiet legends of harmony, but more often for the scars left by desperation, vengeance, betrayal, or grief so profound that it demanded permanence. And so the ancients lifted their most painful and violent stories upward and pinned them among the stars, where no storm or empire could erase them. To them, immortality in the heavens was not a gentle blessing, but a double-edged fate, for while it preserved a name or a deed forever, it also froze the moment of greatest suffering, binding it eternally to the night sky. The result is that when you trace the zodiac across the heavens, you are not following a line of tranquil parables, but walking instead through a gallery of wounds and triumphs, moments when mortals collided with gods, when loyalty cost lives, when courage demanded unbearable sacrifice, and when even victory carried the taste of loss. Consider the stories we have already begun to touch. A boy saved from the altar, only to lose his sister in the sea, her memory etched forever into a strait that still bears her name. A radiant maiden carried unwillingly across the waves by a bull that was no beast at all. Her fate transformed into myth, even as her life was torn from its course. Two brothers so inseparable that death itself could not divide them, forced to share immortality by alternating between the brilliance of Olympus and the shadows of the underworld. These are not serene tales of gentle stars, twinkling kindly upon humanity. They are reminders of how fragile existence is, of how easily joy is broken, of how even the intervention of the gods often brings as much suffering as it does salvation. The constellations, then, can be seen as a kind of eternal archive of extremes, where acts of vengeance are celebrated as cautionary lessons, where moments of desperation are preserved as warnings, and where loss is remembered not to break the spirit, but to teach that even tragedy can shape meaning when woven into the pattern of the sky. To the ancients, every glance upward was an encounter with memory. the memory of battles won at a terrible cost, of loves twisted by divine desire, of mortals caught in games beyond their control, and of creatures who entered the struggle for only a heartbeat of time, yet earned their place in eternity. To stand beneath the zodiac was not to be comforted by serene figures, but to be reminded that life itself is messy, unpredictable, and full of moments when the cost of survival, loyalty, or courage is written in pain, and that somehow those very costs were considered worthy of becoming the permanent language of the stars. If there is one thread that winds itself again and again through these myths, it is the idea of transformation. For the Greeks believed that when a story reached its most unbearable point, when the weight of grief, desire, vengeance, or sacrifice could no longer be carried in the fragile frame of mortal life, the answer was not simply to end, but to change, to cross a boundary between forms, to shift from human to animal, from god to mortal, or from flesh into the everlasting brilliance of a constellation. Transformation was never casual in these tales. It was the climax, the moment when the ordinary order of existence cracked open and revealed something permanent beneath. Sometimes it was mercy, as when a loyal creature was raised into the heavens to be remembered forever, and sometimes it was punishment, a reminder that no one, not even a king or a hero, could escape the consequences of their choices. Yet whether it was given as gift or inflicted as curse, transformation was always a form of preservation, a way of freezing a story so it could be told endlessly under the turning sky. Think of how often the Greeks turned to this device. Lovers pursued by gods dissolved into trees or springs so that their memory would outlast their suffering. Hunters struck down in their pride, reshaped into stags to be torn apart by their own hounds. Sisters and brothers, lifted beyond grief, into constellations that could burn forever as emblems of loyalty. Even the smallest of creatures, a crab that dared to enter a battle far beyond its strength, granted a place in the zodiac not because it triumphed, but because it dared to act at all. Transformation in these myths speaks of a world where endings are never truly endings, where every crisis leaves an imprint, where every desperate leap, whether born of terror or courage, finds its echo somewhere in the fabric of the night sky. To the ancient listener, such stories did more than explain the shapes overhead. They offered a philosophy of survival. Life was fragile, gods were unpredictable, and justice was often absent, but transformation promised that no act, no matter how small, how tragic, or how fleeting, was entirely lost. Even when bodies fell, even when kingdoms crumbled, even when hope itself seemed drowned, the stars bore witness, preserving the memory in a form that could not decay. This is why the zodiac is not merely a circle of animals and symbols, but a cycle of transformations. Each one a reminder that change is the only constant, and that in change lies both warning and consolation. And so the zodiac begins with Aries, whose story does not open with triumph or celebration, but with the chill of fear and the desperate hope of escape, for the ram of golden wings did not descend from the heavens to deliver glory, but to carry two endangered children, away from a death that had been decreed in the cold language of an oracle. In the kingdom of Boeotia there lived a boy named Phrixus and his sister Hel, children of a king whose heart had turned from their mother to another woman, a stepmother whose ambition was greater than her compassion, and who saw the children not as innocents, but as obstacles to her own designs. With the cunning patience that so often fuels tragedy, she plotted famine upon the land, corrupted the words of sacred messengers, and brought forth a prophecy that claimed only the sacrifice of the king's son could restore abundance. It was in this moment, when Phrixus was bound for the altar, that salvation arrived in the form of a ram unlike any seen before. Its fleece spun from living gold, and its wings strong enough to bear the weight of two children away from the horror that awaited them. The ram knelt at the altar as the priests faltered its golden light, dazzling the terrified crowd, and in that instant Phrixus and Hel mounted its back, clutching at its radiant fleece as it surged into the sky, soaring eastward toward a future uncertain, but at least alive. Yet even as the creature bore them across seas and winds, rescue proved not free of loss. For as they crossed the narrow strait between the Aegean and the Black Sea, Hel slipped from the ram's back, falling into the waters below, her name forever attached to the place now known as the Hellespont. Thus the myth teaches from the very beginning that escape can carry sorrow with it, that salvation can leave scars that never fade, and that even miracles arrive with a cost that must be borne. Phrixus alone reached the distant land of Colchis, where he was received with unexpected kindness by a foreign king. But gratitude demanded a gesture, and so the boy who had been saved by the ram was compelled to sacrifice his rescuer upon arrival, hanging the fleece in a sacred grove, where it would gleam with such brilliance that it later drew Jason and the Argonauts into their own peril. Aries, fixed in the heavens by Zeus, became not merely a reminder of a creature as courage, but a constellation charged with all the contradictions of survival. Triumph entwined with grief, rescue shadowed by sacrifice, beginnings haunted by endings. To the ancients who looked upward each spring as the ram's stars rose in the east, Aries was not only the herald of new seasons and fertile fields, but also the eternal image of a leap taken in desperation, a flight that saved a life but not without loss, a moment when courage itself was transformed into starlight, so that all who gazed upon it would remember that survival, though precious, is rarely ever clean. Yet the story of Aries does not end with the ram's sacrifice, for in Greek mythology no act of devotion, no offering of such weight, remains isolated. And the shimmering fleece that once carried Phrixus and Hell away from death became the centerpiece of one of the greatest adventures ever told, a saga that would entwine kings, heroes, and gods in a struggle that echoed across generations. When Phrixus hung the golden fleece in the sacred grove of Colchis, guarded by a sleepless dragon whose coils never loosened, he could not have foreseen that this single relic would one day ignite the quest of Jason and his Argonauts, a voyage that came to symbolize the hunger of mortals for glory and the dangers that await those who chase what gleams too brightly. The fleece was not simply a prize of wealth or beauty, it was a token of divine favor, a fragment of the miraculous ram's sacrifice, and so it drew to itself the ambitions of rulers and the desires of heroes, until the very name of Aries was forever bound to Jason's long and perilous expedition. Jason's journey, filled with trials set by gods and betrayals woven by men, would bring him face to face with the fleece's guardian, and it was only through the aid of Medea's sorceress lover and eventual destroyer that the fleece was torn from its resting place and carried back across the sea. The irony of the myth is profound. What had once been the instrument of salvation for two endangered children became the object of peril for an entire band of warriors, reminding us that symbols of safety and hope can just as easily be twisted into lures for danger. In this way, the tale of Aries reached far beyond the fate of Phrixus and Hell, threading itself into one of the most enduring cycles of Greek storytelling, a cycle that revealed how the gifts of the gods are never free, and how the brilliance of gold, whether woven into fleece or coin, so often blinds mortals to the costs hidden beneath its glow. Thus, when the ancients raised their eyes to the ram's constellation, they did not see a single story but a chain of events, stretching from a desperate escape to a legendary voyage, from the salvation of a child to the ambition of a generation. Aries was both the beginning and the seed of countless other tales, a reminder that myths, like lives, do not stand alone, but ripple outward, shaping what follows in ways no one can predict. And so Aries, gleaming at the start of the Zodiac, carried with it not only the memory of a golden ram as courage and a sister as tragic fall, but also the weight of a treasure that lured men to risk everything in pursuit of a promise that, like the stars themselves, could be seen but never truly possessed. From these intertwined threads of rescue, sacrifice, and unrelenting consequence, Aries emerged in the ancient imagination not as a gentle herald of spring alone, but as the constellation that embodied the very spirit of beginnings forged through struggle. For the ram's flight was the first spark of a story that carried both salvation and sorrow, and it was precisely in that duality that the ancients found meaning. When the ram rose in the eastern sky each year, glittering along the horizon as winter loosened its grip, it was seen as a reminder that all ventures, no matter how noble or necessary, are shadowed by risk, and that to step forward into a new season or a new endeavor requires a courage that does not deny tragedy, but accepts it as part of the price of moving on. Aries was the image of momentum, of leaping from the altar of despair into the uncertain air, of holding tight to the chance of survival even when loss could not be avoided. And so it became a constellation, not only of myth but of philosophy, teaching that beginnings are rarely clean or easy, but they are always possible when one dares to act. For the Greeks, the ram's story resonated with the cycles of their own lives, for every spring demanded boldness. The planting of seeds in the hope of harvest, the launching of ships into unpredictable seas, the willingness to venture into wars or journeys whose outcomes were hidden in shadow. In Aries, they saw a celestial emblem that sanctioned courage, even when the odds seemed impossible, that celebrated the act of trying, even when the result could not be guaranteed. The golden fleece, gleaming in distant Colchis, was not only a relic of salvation, but a symbol of aspiration, proof that even the most fragile of beginnings could ripple outward to inspire quests, alliances, and legends. Thus, Aries became fixed, not only in the stars, but in the human heart, as the eternal sign of daring. The fiery push into the unknown, the leap that might save or destroy, but that, either way, refused to be paralyzed by fear. And so whenever the ram's constellation appeared overhead, it was more than a cluster of stars. It was a summons, a call to act, a reminder that life itself demands movement, even when the path forward is clouded with uncertainty. The ancients knew that to hesitate too long was to risk perishing in place, while to leap, as and hell had leaped onto the ram's back, was to embrace the chance of both triumph and loss. That dual truth is what gave Aries its power, for in its golden fleece, its desperate flight, and its tragic cost, lay the eternal lesson that beginnings are not defined by safety, but by the courage to begin at all. And in this way, Aries became the luminous guardian of every new season, every fresh attempt, and every heart bold enough to reach for what lies just beyond the edge of fear. If Aries rose in the heavens as the sign of daring beginnings, then it is Taurus that reminds us how beauty and terror can walk hand in hand. For beneath its constellation lies one of the most haunting and enduring tales of desire and transformation. The story of Europa and the god who would not be denied. Europa was a princess of radiant grace, daughter of a Phoenician king, whose laughter and presence drew admiration wherever she walked, and it was said that her beauty did not merely capture mortal eyes, but reached Olympus itself, stirring the restless heart of Zeus, the king of the gods. Unable to master his longing and unwilling to reveal himself in his true, thunderous form, chose instead the path of deception, shaping himself into a magnificent white bull, whose hide gleamed like polished ivory, whose breath was soft as sea foam, and whose presence carried none of the menace that lurked within. One morning, as Europa and her attendants wandered by the shore gathering flowers, the great bull approached them, its eyes gentle, its movements calm, so that instead of fear, the maidens felt only wonder. They draped garlands across its horns, they touched its silken hide, and in their delight, Europa herself climbed upon its back, laughing as she settled onto the creature that seemed tame enough to bear her weight. Yet no sooner had she done so than the bull surged forward, its hooves striking the sand, its body plunging into the surf, and before her companions could cry out, the bull was carrying Europa across the waves, each bound of muscle revealing the divine strength hidden beneath the disguise. Terror overtook her as the shore vanished, but the bull did not falter, pressing on toward the distant horizon, until the waters gave way to the island of Crete, where Zeus revealed his true self and bound Europa's fate forever to his will. This abduction, preserved in art, poetry, and the constellation of Taurus, is one of the clearest examples of how the Greeks wove human vulnerability into the fabric of the heavens. The bull was not merely a symbol of brute strength, but of irresistible force disguised in beauty, of trust betrayed by power, of innocence drawn into the schemes of gods. To the ancients, Taurus gleamed in the spring sky, not only as a celestial marker of the plowing season and the renewal of the earth, but as a reminder that desire, no matter how radiant its form, can conceal danger, and that transformations, even those wrapped in majesty, often carried shadows within. Thus Taurus became a dual emblem, the steadfast strength that drove the labors of men and nourished the fertility of the fields, and the mythic warning that what dazzles the eye may also entrap the heart. Yet the white bull of Europa was only one face of a symbol that reached far deeper into the ancient imagination. For across the Mediterranean world, the bull was more than an animal. It was an emblem of power, fertility, and the very cycles of the earth itself. And so when the Greeks looked upon Taurus in the heavens, they did not see a single story, but a constellation that echoed through countless myths and rituals. In the rhythm of agriculture, the bull's strength was indispensable, for it was the creature that broke the stubborn soil, that turned the furrows where seeds could take root, and in its bellowing force people heard the voice of the seasons themselves, calling them to labor and promising renewal. To carve a bull into stone, or raise one as an offering, was not simply an act of worship, it was an acknowledgement that human survival was bound to the creature as endurance, that the fertility of the fields and the prosperity of the people were tethered to the might of its body. This reverence found its way into stories as varied and strange as those of Crete, where the Cretan bull rampaged across the island until it was subdued by Heracles in one of his great labors, a beast so powerful that it became both prize and curse, shaping the fate of a kingdom. From that bull came yet another legend, darker and more unsettling, the birth of the Minotaur, a monstrous being with the body of a man and the head of a bull, born of divine meddling and human weakness, confined within the endless corridors of the labyrinth built by Daedalus. The Minotaur, though a creature of terror, was also an echo of the same primal force embodied by Taurus, fertility gone awry, strength turned inward and twisted, a reminder that what nourishes life can also consume it when balance is lost. Thus, Taurus stood in the heavens as more than the mark of Europa's abduction. It was a constellation layered with meanings, some luminous, others shadowed, all tied to the enduring presence of the bull in human life and imagination. To farmers it was the celestial bull that guided the plow and brought fertility to the earth. To storytellers, it was the beast of Crete whose legacy produced both triumph and monstrosity. To priests and poets, it was a figure of sacrifice and abundance, a creature whose death could ensure the continuation of life. In every form, the bull spoke of strengths, sometimes gentle, sometimes destructive, always powerful, and so Taurus became a reminder that the same force which feeds the world can also unleash chaos if it is not honored and respected. To the ancients who lifted their eyes to the heavens, Taurus was never merely the memory of Zeus' deception or Europa's fateful journey, for while myth clothed the constellation in drama, the stars themselves spoke in a language that was older than story and woven into the very survival of those who watched them. Each spring, when Taurus rose bright in the evening sky, it carried with it the promise of renewal, the assurance that the long grip of winter was loosening, and that the earth would soon answer the call of seed and plow. In the bull's horns and massive form, they saw not only the might of the god disguised, but the raw strength required to break the soil, to prepare the fields to turn the world once again toward abundance. The constellation became a celestial signpost, a signal that the seasons were shifting, that it was time to act, to sow, to trust in the cycle of fertility that had governed human life since the beginning. In this way, Taurus was both myth and measure, both the story of a maiden carried across the sea, and the practical reminder that life depended upon the rhythms written in the stars. The bull was the archetype of power, not a destructive force alone, but a sustaining one, the embodiment of the energy that allowed civilizations to grow and endure. Farmers timed their labors by its rising. Priests saw in its shape the eternal bond between heaven and earth, and poets traced in its outline the line between order and chaos. For the bull could as easily nourish the land as ravage it, just as the seasons themselves could bless or withhold. The constellation's brilliance was therefore both reassuring and sobering, reminding those who gazed upon it that strength must be honored, fertility respected, and transitions embraced, for the turning of the year was as inexorable as the slow march of stars across the sky. Thus, Taurus became not simply a tale of pursuit and abduction, but a symbol of the broader human condition, the need to recognize power in its many forms, to celebrate its gifts while guarding against its dangers, to understand that fertility and destruction are twinned forces that cannot be separated. When the ancients told the story of Europa and the bull, they were not only recounting divine desire, they were layering meaning onto a constellation that already governed their lives, binding myth and necessity together until the two could not be disentangled. To see Taurus shining in the heavens was to see strength in all its complexity, fertile, fierce, protective, and perilous, an eternal reminder that every season of growth carries within it the possibility of ruin, and that every cycle of abundance must be honored with humility. If Taurus marked the heavens with the raw force of strength and the unyielding rhythm of the seasons, then Gemini offered something far more intimate, for its light was not bound to the plow or the harvest alone, but to the eternal bond between two brothers whose devotion to one another defied even the laws of life and death. Castor and Pollux, known together as the Dioscuri, were born of the same mother, the Queen Leda, yet their bloodlines were divided. For while Castor was mortal, the son of the Spartan king, Tyndareus, Pollux was immortal, the son of Zeus himself, who had taken the form of a swan to seduce or overpower Leda on the banks of a river. This mingling of mortal and divine produced twins, who were as alike in appearance as they were different in destiny. And it was in the tension between their fates that their legend was forged. From their earliest years, the twins were inseparable, companions in hunting and in war, protectors of sailors and athletes, symbols of unity and courage wherever they went. Their bond was not one of convenience or circumstance, but of fierce loyalty, each brother living for the other, each refusing to be defined without the presence of his twin. Yet the world of Greek myth, shaped by conflict and cruelty, could not leave such devotion untouched, and it was during a violent quarrel with rivals over cattle and women that tragedy fell upon them. Castor, being mortal, was struck down in the clash, his life spilling away on the battlefield, while Pollux, the undying son of Zeus, stood powerless to call him back. For the first time, their bond was torn by the division of mortality, and in his grief Pollux refused the gift of immortality if it meant living without his brother. Zeus, moved by this plea, offered a compromise that was itself both gift and sorrow. The twins would share their fates, alternating between the brilliance of Olympus and the shadows of Hades, so that neither would ever again be wholly separated from the other, yet neither would know peace in a single realm. In the heavens, their figures were fixed as Gemini, shining side by side, eternal reminders of loyalty so fierce that it reshaped the very will of the gods. To the ancients, the sight of Gemini was more than a constellation. It was a promise that love and brotherhood could endure beyond death, that sacrifice could transform even mortality into something immortal. Sailors prayed to them as guardians of the sea, athletes honored them as patrons of strength and unity, and poets sang of them as the eternal twins whose devotion had bound heaven and underworld together. Thus, Gemini gleamed in the sky, not as a simple pair of stars, but as a celestial story of loyalty, sacrifice, and the power of bonds that cannot be broken. A reminder that even when life is fragile, love can make it infinite, and that to stand beside another without faltering is itself an act worthy of the heavens. What gives the tale of Gemini its enduring weight is not merely the closeness of the brothers in life, but the choice that followed in death. For when Castor fell beneath the strikes of mortal battle, and Pollux looked upon him, lifeless and still, the immortal son of Zeus found that eternity without his twin was a prison more unbearable than mortality itself. In that moment, Pollux did not cling to the privilege of divinity. He did not retreat into Olympus to bask in the undying glow reserved for gods and their chosen children. But instead, he cast his gaze upward and pleaded with his father to let him share the burden of death, so that the bond forged in birth and sealed in blood might not be broken by fate. To offer up half of his immortality was no small thing, for in Greek thought, immortality was the greatest gift the gods could bestow, yet Pollux treated it as nothing if it meant leaving his brother behind in the silence of the grave. Zeus, whose whims so often bent toward cruelty, was moved by a plea so rare that it reshaped the heavens themselves. He granted Pollux' wish, not by taking away his divinity entirely, but by weaving the two brothers into a shared destiny. Together they would alternate between the brilliance of Olympus and the darkness of Hades, spending one day among the gods and the next among the shades, never wholly alive nor wholly dead, but forever united in a rhythm that mirrored the eternal rise and fall of the stars themselves. In this way, Pollux' devotion became not only the salvation of Castor, but the birth of the constellation. Gemini, the twin lights that rise together in the night sky side by side, their radiance unbroken, even as their natures differ. To those who looked upward in the ancient world, the story of Pollux' sacrifice was not a tale of despair, but of hope. A reminder that love, loyalty, and devotion could bend even the iron laws of mortality. Sailors who faced the endless horizon with nothing but fragile ships to keep them from the sea as hunger, prayed for the Dioscuri to appear as guiding lights, believing that the twins would stand by them as they had stood by each other. Athletes competing for honor saw in Gemini the promise that true strength lay not only in muscle, but in the bonds of trust and unity. And storytellers, whispering the old tales by firelight, found in Pollux' choice a lesson that no crown, no wealth, no gift of immortality had value if it could not be shared with those one loved most. Thus, Gemini became a constellation not of solitary brilliance, but of shared endurance. A beacon of loyalty that transcended even death. A reminder etched forever in the stars that the truest form of immortality is not found in living forever, but in refusing to abandon those who give meaning to life itself. Across the ancient world, the presence of the Dioscuri stretched far beyond the quiet beauty of their constellation. For Castor and Pollux were not merely remembered as figures of myth, but invoked as living guardians by those whose lives balanced constantly on the edge of danger. Sailors venturing into the unpredictable expanse of the sea believed the twins watched over them, for when storms raged and waves rose like walls of black, glass twin stars were sometimes seen flickering above the masts, a natural light phenomenon later called St. Elmo's fire, which they interpreted as the Dioscuri descending to guide them safely through the tempest. In these moments, the myth of brotherly devotion was no longer just a story told by poets. It became a tangible force of protection, a sign that unity and loyalty had power even over the sea's fury. Warriors, too, called upon the twins, believing that in the chaos of battle, the spirit of Castor and Pollux could grant them courage and the strength to fight side by side, as if bound by unbreakable bonds. To fight with loyalty, to shield a companion with one's own body, to move as one against the enemy, this was the essence of Gemini. Not as stars in the sky, but as ideals lived out on the battlefield. Athletes, whose contests echoed both the struggle of war and the discipline of survival, honored the twins as patrons of skill, endurance, and above all, partnership. In the training grounds and arenas, the Dioscuri were invoked as models of balance and unity, for their legend reminded competitors that victory achieved in selfish isolation was hollow, while triumph forged in trust and camaraderie carried the weight of something greater. The Greeks, who wove myth into every corner of life, saw in Castor and Pollux the ultimate proof that strength was magnified when shared, and that devotion was a force stronger than any single arm or fleeting glory. To the common people, they were figures of hope, protectors who had chosen to divide their immortality so no one would ever face the abyss alone. Patrons who taught that even when fate divided life and death, love could bridge the distance. Thus the Dioscuri stood not only as stars shining above, but as ideals shaping the way communities understood loyalty, sacrifice, and unity. Each appearance of their constellation was a reminder that to face storms, wars, or contests without companionship was to stand exposed. But with unity, even the greatest dangers could be endured. In their myth, the ancients found not just the comfort of protection, but the challenge of living up to an ideal. To fight beside one another with unwavering loyalty, to face danger together without fear, and to let devotion transform fragility into endurance. Gemini, therefore, was not only a tale inscribed in the heavens, but a living call to embody the same unity that once bound two brothers so fiercely that even death could not undo it. Beyond the sea spray that clung to the prayers of sailors, and beyond the war cries that carried the names of the twins into battle, the legacy of Castor and Pollux seeped into the very framework of civic life, shaping how both Greeks and Romans imagined loyalty, justice, and the fragile but essential bonds that held their societies together. The Dioscuri were not honored merely as divine protectors, but as embodiments of a principle that could govern cities and nations. The idea that strength is multiplied when men stand as brothers, that justice is secured when loyalty extends beyond self-interest, and that no community can endure if its members are unwilling to sacrifice for one another. Their altars stood in public squares, their temples rose in the heart of cities, and their images appeared in coins and carvings, not simply as a celebration of myth, but as reminders that the health of a state depended upon the same virtues that bound the twins together. In Sparta, where discipline and unity defined the very essence of life, the Dioscuri were revered as models of the warrior bond, teaching that a city could only endure if each man was willing to fight, not for himself, but for his brother at his side. In Rome, their influence grew even greater, for it was said that during the Battle of Lake Regillus two horsemen of radiant beauty, recognized as none other than Castor and Pollux, appeared to lead the Roman cavalry to victory, after which they were honored with a temple in the Forum itself, planted at the center of political and civic life. To Romans, the twins became the very embodiment of fides, the sacred trust that bound citizen to citizen, soldier to soldier, and ruler to ruled, a trust that was considered the backbone of their republic and later their empire. Their presence in civic life was more than ceremonial. It was ideological. By raising Castor and Pollux as patrons of loyalty and justice, leaders reminded the people that unity was not optional, but vital, that betrayal and selfish ambition tore at the fabric of society, while devotion to one another stitched it together. The Dioscuri became symbols of the brotherhood that should exist between allies, the justice that should govern decisions, and the loyalty that should bind a people in times of peace and in times of war. To look upon Gemini in the night sky was, for the ancients, not only to remember the story of two brothers defying death, but to feel the weight of responsibility that each citizen, like each twin, must be willing to sacrifice for the whole, that no society could thrive unless its people stood together in loyalty, justice, and brotherhood. If Gemini filled the heavens with the shining ideal of brotherhood and devotion that could bend even the will of Zeus, then the constellation that followed offered a lesson of a very different kind. For Cancer was born not from the grandeur of princes or the triumph of warriors, but from the smallest of creatures, a crab whose moment in myth was so brief and so humble that one might almost overlook it, and yet it was precisely this obscurity that gave the story its power. During the second of Heracles' great labors, the hero found himself locked in a desperate struggle with the Hydra, a monstrous serpent whose many heads regrew, twofold each time one was cut away, making the battle seem endless and almost unwinnable. As Heracles hacked and fought, sweat and blood mingling beneath the sweltering sun, here ever the goddess of opposition to his strength, ever determined to see him fail, sought to tip the scales by summoning aid for the beast. She called forth a crab from the depths, a creature far too small to match the might of a hero, but commanded nonetheless to enter the fray. Obedient to the will of the goddess, the crab scuttled across the marshy ground, its claws snapping, and hurled itself against the ankle of Heracles. To any other figure in myth, this action might have been laughable, a hopeless gesture of defiance against a man who had already faced lions and would go on to wrestle gods themselves. Yet in its small act of loyalty to Hera, the crab revealed something that the Greeks valued deeply: devotion expressed not in triumph, but in willingness to fight, even when defeat is certain. Heracles, irritated but unshaken, crushed the creature beneath his heel and continued his battle with the Hydra. But the story did not end in the mud where the crab's shell was shattered. For Hera, though filled with resentment, honored the crab's sacrifice by lifting it into the sky, fixing it forever as the constellation Cancer. To those who gazed upward, the faint and modest stars of Cancer carried none of the roaring brilliance of Leo or the piercing clarity of Gemini, and yet that was its meaning. Cancer was a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage, even the gestures that seem futile in the face of overwhelming force, were not without value, for they too could earn a place in eternity. Where Gemini celebrated devotion that defied death with radiant brilliance, Cancer spoke in quieter tones, whispering of loyalty, endurance, and service. The virtues that often go unnoticed, but without which great struggles cannot be endured. In the crab's brief clash with Heracles, the ancients found a symbol of the overlooked ally, the humble supporter, the one who stands by duty rather than glory. And in this way, Cancer became not merely a faint constellation in the zodiac, but a lesson etched in starlight. That even the smallest life, when lived with loyalty, can be immortal. What makes the constellation of Cancer so remarkable is not its brilliance, for its stars are dim and often overlooked, compared to the dazzling presence of others, but rather the quiet dignity of its story. For in a sky filled with lions and heroes, with bulls and twins, the crab was immortalized, not for strength or grandeur, but for loyalty, endurance, and the uncelebrated courage of service. To the ancients, this was no small lesson. The crab's gesture may have been hopeless against Heracles' might, and its end may have been swift beneath his heel. Yet Hera's decision to raise it into the heavens gave voice to an idea that echoed through Greek thought: that valor does not always roar, that sacrifice does not always conquer, and that the worth of an action lies not in its outcome, but in the devotion that compels it. Cancer's stars, faint though they are, became a symbol for those who understood that life is not always lived in the blaze of victory, but in the quiet persistence of duty, in the willingness to stand by a cause or a companion, even when recognition will never come. The crab's immortality was a paradox, insignificant in power, yet eternal in remembrance, and so it spoke directly to those whose lives were spent in patient labor, in unseen loyalty, in tasks that did not bring glory, but without which the great achievements of others could never have been realized. In the fields, where farmers bent to their work under the relentless sun, Cancer's appearance in the summer sky was a mirror of their own endurance, their unheralded contribution to the survival of their people. In the city, where servants, soldiers, and common folk upheld the structures of life, the constellation whispered the same truth that service, though quiet, sustains the world. Thus, Cancer stood as a constellation of humility, not meant to dazzle, but to remind, not to overwhelm with splendor, but to affirm that no act of loyalty is wasted, no gesture of endurance forgotten. Where Gemini proclaimed the glory of devotion that conquers death, Cancer told the gentler story of devotion that accepts obscurity, of courage that does not seek recognition, of sacrifice that leaves no monument but shines faintly, eternally, in the fabric of the night sky. In this way, Cancer gave the zodiac balance, teaching that the greatness of human character is found not only in legendary deeds, but also in the quiet resilience of those who give without thought of glory. In time, the constellation of Cancer took on meanings that stretched far beyond its mythic birth in the struggle of Heracles. For the ancients did not only see the crab as a faint emblem of loyalty and service, they also wove its appearance into the great clock of the heavens, tying it to the summer solstice and to the cycles of agriculture and daily life that governed their survival. When the sun reached its highest point in the year, and the days stretched to their longest, it entered the sign of Cancer, and so the constellation became forever linked with that moment of transition. When the earth stood at the peak of its fertility, yet also began its slow turning back toward the darker seasons, this association gave Cancer a role that was at once practical and symbolic. Practical because farmers watched its rising as a sign of when to tend their crops beneath the blazing sun. Symbolic because it embodied the idea that even at the height of abundance, endurance, and patience were required to see the harvest through. For those who lived by the land, Cancer was not a tale told only at night, but a signal embedded into the rhythm of their labor. The solstice marked the time when the earth demanded the most from those who tilled it, when the heat was relentless, when the work of watering, weeding, and watching over the fragile shoots could not be neglected. The crab, slow and steady, became an emblem of this persistence, its stars, faint but constant, much like the patient hands that coaxed food from the soil. In households, too, Cancer became tied to the quiet routines that sustained daily life, the cooking, the tending, the endless tasks of care and service that rarely drew celebration, but without which no society could endure. The constellations seemed to whisper to those who labored in obscurity, "You are seen, you are remembered, and though your work may not blaze like fire across the heavens, it is fixed forever in the eternal cycles of time." Thus Cancer was not only a myth of a crab crushed beneath a hero's heel, but a marker of the solstice, a symbol of the balance between peak abundance and the steady endurance required to preserve it. A reminder that life moves not in sudden bursts of glory alone, but in long, quiet stretches of patience. Its dim stars did not diminish its meaning. They deepened it, aligning the constellation with the truth that the brightest deeds may be rare, but it is the steady rhythm of loyalty, labor, and service that allows life to continue. In this way, Cancer became both a mythic emblem of sacrifice and a practical guide for living, bridging the world of the gods and the daily struggles of those who looked up to the heavens for both stories and signs. Unlike the blazing constellations that dominate the sky with their brilliance, Cancer has always been subtle, a cluster of faint stars that often escapes the casual gaze. And yet it was precisely this quiet presence that gave it meaning for the ancients, who saw in its dim light a reflection of virtues less celebrated, but no less essential: patience, steady labor, and the resilience that carries one through the long, unglamorous stretches of existence. To them, Cancer's modest glow was not a flaw, but a lesson, for the heavens were not made only to honor lions and heroes, but also to preserve the truth that greatness is often found in persistence rather than spectacle. The crab's faint constellation mirrored the life of those who rose before dawn to work the fields, whose backs bent beneath the sun in endless toil, who endured the rhythm of seasons with neither complaint nor expectation of glory, and who, like the constellation itself, carried out their duties with quiet constancy. In this way, Cancer became a reminder that the human spirit is not defined only by shining victories, but by the resilience to continue, to push forward through difficulties that might crush the body, but cannot extinguish devotion. Just as the crab hurled itself against the heel of Heracles, knowing the outcome yet acting anyway, so too did countless people in the ancient world live out lives of service and endurance, their struggles unnoticed by poets, but no less vital to the survival of their families and communities. Cancer's faintness became symbolic of hidden strength, of the quiet kind of courage that is invisible to the crowd, yet indispensable to the world. To see it rise at the height of summer was to be reminded that the blazing sun and the swelling crops owed their triumph not to sudden miracles, but to the slow, unyielding work of patient hands and enduring hearts. Thus, though dim in the sky, Cancer shone in the imagination of those who understood that resilience is a form of heroism, that steady effort shapes the world as surely as bold action, and that patience, though often silent, is as worthy of immortality as the loudest deeds of gods and kings. The constellation taught that one need not dazzle to matter, for even faint light can guide, and even humble persistence can leave a mark that time itself cannot erase. In this way, Cancer completed its transformation from a crushed creature in myth to a timeless emblem of endurance, whispering to every generation that survival belongs not only to the mighty, but also to the steadfast. If Cancer whispered of resilience in its quietest form, then Leo thundered across the heavens as its opposite, blazing with ferocity and strength. For few myths capture the raw clash between man and beast as vividly as the tale of the Nemean lion, the monstrous creature whose defeat marked the very first of Heracles' 12 great labors. The lion was no ordinary animal roaming the hills of Nemea. Its hide was said to be impervious to iron, bronze, or stone, a skin so impenetrable that no weapon forged by mortal hands could pierce it, and its roar echoed like thunder, shaking the courage of any who dared approach. Villages whispered of its hunger, of flocks slaughtered and hunters slain, and the land itself seemed to cower under its shadow. It was into this terror that Heracles was sent, not yet the seasoned hero, who would later face hydras, giants, and gods, but a man at the beginning of his long road of penance and glory, charged with the impossible task of felling a beast that could not be wounded. When Heracles first sought the lion, he tried to meet it with bow and arrow, believing his unmatched skill and strength would be enough. Yet every shaft clattered harmlessly against the monster's golden pelt, falling to the ground as if the lion were shielded by the gods themselves. The futility of weapons only deepened the dread of the task, but Heracles did not retreat, for retreat was never the path of his legend. Driven into the dark of its cave, the lion confronted him in the close quarters where its claws and fangs gleamed in the half-light. It was then that Heracles, discarding the tools that had failed him, relied on the purest measure of his might, his bare hands. Grappling with the beast in a struggle that shook the stones, he forced his arms around its massive throat, the lion thrashing and roaring until the sound broke into silence beneath his crushing strength. When the beast lay still, Heracles had not only completed his first labor, but proven that true victory was not always a matter of weapons or cunning, but of endurance and unyielding resolve. Yet even in death, the lion gave him a gift that shaped his legend, for Heracles, seeking to skin the creature, found no blade could touch its hide. It was only by using one of the lion's own claws that he managed the task, stripping the pelt and fashioning it into armor. From that day forward, Heracles wore the lion's skin as a mantle, its gaping jaws forming a helmet over his head, its impenetrable hide shielding him in battle. Thus, the Nemean lion lived on, not merely as a vanquished monster, but as a symbol of strength transferred, its power carried into the figure of the hero who had overcome it. And when Zeus placed the lion among the stars, it was not to honor defeat, but to commemorate defiance. The image of a creature so fierce that only the greatest of heroes could master it fixed. Forever in the Zodiac as Leo, the roaring embodiment of courage, endurance, and the relentless struggle between man and the wild forces that test him. What set the Nemean lion apart from every other beast of legend was not merely its ferocity, but its invulnerability, for in the tales told around hearths and temples, the lioness hide was described as so thick, so unyielding that no sword could cut it, and no spear could pierce it, making the creature less an animal than a living fortress of flesh and fury. To the ancients, this detail was not only an embellishment of terror, but a profound symbol. The lion's impervious skin embodied the idea of obstacles that cannot be overcome by ordinary means, challenges so immense that they strip away every false tool, until only raw strength, perseverance, and the will to endure remain. The lion thus became a mirror of the heroic struggle itself, a reminder that true courage is tested not in battles that can be won easily, but in those that demand the very limits of human resolve. Heracles' decision to cast aside his weapons and grapple with the beast bare-handed gave the myth its lasting resonance, for it showed that heroism is not measured by the sharpness of a blade or the swiftness of strategy, but by the capacity to face an enemy on its own terms, to wrestle with forces that appear untouchable, and to refuse surrender, even when victory seems beyond reach. The lion's impenetrable hide, which defied every arrow and blade, turned the struggle into something more than a physical contest. It became a ritual of transformation, a trial by which Heracles proved that his strength was not a gift alone, but a burden he was willing to bear, a responsibility that demanded he face the impossible again and again. And when he emerged victorious, wearing the lion as skin as his mantle, he was not only clothed in armor, but wrapped in the very essence of the challenge he had conquered, carrying its power as both shield and reminder of the struggle it took to obtain. In the heavens, Leo's presence captured this duality perfectly. To look upon the lion's constellation was to see not only the grandeur of strength, but also the cost of earning it, the exhaustion, the danger, and the endless determination that heroic struggle requires. Its stars blazed brightest during the height of summer, a season when the heat pressed down like an unrelenting foe, when crops demanded endurance, and when life itself seemed a trial of resilience. And so, Leo became both celestial guardian and seasonal reflection of what it meant to persevere. For the ancients, the lion's hide, invulnerable and eternal, was a message written in starlight, that strength is not the absence of struggle, but the product of it, that even the fiercest challenges can be transformed into protection, and that the trials which threaten to destroy us may one day become the very armor that carries us forward. The moment of victory over the Nemean lion did not end with the beast's collapse upon the rocky ground, for the true lesson of the story came in what followed, when Heracles, standing above the lifeless body, discovered that conquest alone was not enough. The lion's hide, gleaming with its impossible toughness, mocked every attempt to pierce it, even in death, and his blade after. Blade slid uselessly against the pelt. The hero faced a dilemma as great as the battle itself. How does one claim proof of triumph when the very nature of the foe resists being undone? It was then, in an act that blended ingenuity with persistence, that Heracles seized upon the only weapon that could overcome the beast's hide, its own claw. With that curved talon, sharper than any human-forged steel, he tore through the impenetrable skin, peeling it away not with borrowed tools, but with the essence of the monster itself. In this act, the myth revealed another truth about heroism, that strength is not only the power to overcome, but the wisdom to adapt, to turn the nature of the challenge into the key for its defeat. By using the lion's own claw to strip its hide, Heracles transformed a symbol of invincibility into a trophy of endurance, proving that even the most insurmountable obstacles carry within them the means to be conquered if one has the patience to discover it. When at last the hide was his, he did not discard it as spoils, but claimed it as his second skin, draping it over his shoulders and placing the gaping jaws upon his head as a helmet. From that day onward, wherever Heracles went, the image of the lion was inseparable from his own, its indestructible hide becoming both his shield in battle and his emblem of victory, a constant reminder that what once seemed unconquerable had been made his armor. The sight of Heracles clad in the lioness pelt carried deep resonance for those who told and retold his story, for it showed that heroism was not simply about destruction, but about transformation, the turning of an enemy's strength into one's own protection. In the heavens, the constellation Leo embodied this same lesson, blazing in the summer sky as a reminder that trials which appear invulnerable can be endured, mastered, and even turned into sources of power. For the farmer, laboring beneath the burning sun, for the warrior facing an enemy's charge, for the citizen enduring hardship, Leo, as stars, spoke of courage that not only defeats, but carries its victories forward, stitched into the very fabric of survival. In this way, the lion lived on, not only in the memory of its struggle, but in the mantle of Heracles, in the constellation overhead, and in the enduring lesson that what resists us most fiercely may one day become the very armor that guards our future. As the myth of the Nemean lion settled into the memory of Greece, the constellation of Leo took on meanings that stretched far beyond the story of Heracles' labor. For its blazing stars came to mark not only the triumph of strength, but the rhythms of the natural world itself. And in their seasonal rising, people saw reflections of courage, endurance, and the endless cycle of toil and reward that sustained life. When Leo stood dominant in the night sky, it was the height of summer, when the sun's heat was relentless, when fields shimmered beneath waves of burning air, and when the fate of the harvest depended on whether farmers could endure the most punishing weeks of the year. Just as Heracles had wrestled a beast whose hide no weapon could pierce, so too did ordinary men and women wrestle with the earth itself, bending their backs against sun and soil, drawing from themselves a strength that was less dramatic, but no less heroic. For the ancients, Leo's fiery presence overhead was both an omen and a mirror. The lion's constellation roared across the sky, like the heat that scorched the fields, a reminder that survival required courage, not only on battlefields but in furrows and vineyards where life's sustenance was won. The farmers who endured the searing sun to bring forth grain and grapes, the workers who persisted through exhaustion to secure the survival of their families, the soldiers who trained beneath the same burning sky to defend their citadel, saw in Leo a reflection of their own endurance. The lion, invincible and fierce, symbolized the capacity to withstand hardship and transform struggle into strength, just as Heracles had turned the beast's hide into his armor. In this way, Leo became more than a tale of monstrous conquest. It became a seasonal emblem of courage, tied to the time when the year demanded the most of its people. To face the lion in myth was to test one's might against an impenetrable foe. But to live beneath Leo's rising was to test one's spirit against the unyielding heat of the harvest season. Both demanded resilience, both required endurance, and both promised that what seemed unbearable could be overcome. The constellation shone as a beacon not only of heroism, but of survival, teaching that courage is not the absence of hardship, but the will to endure it, that endurance is not passive suffering, but the active struggle to continue when strength falters. and that from this struggle comes the reward of sustenance, protection, and renewal. Thus, when the ancients raised their eyes to Leo, they did not see a lion alone, nor even Heracles' victory, but a cosmic reminder that every generation must find within itself the courage to withstand its own trials, the endurance to labor through its own summers, and the faith that from struggle comes the harvest that sustains all life. Where Leo burned in the heavens as the image of raw strength and endurance, Virgo glimmered with a quieter, more sorrowful light, for her constellation carried not the roar of battle or the labor of the harvest, but the memory of a maiden who embodied justice, purity, and fairness, and whose departure from the world marked one of the great tragedies of the mythic imagination. She was Astrea, daughter of Zeus and Themis, a goddess who walked among mortals during what the poets called the Golden Age, when humanity lived without greed or war, when truth was honored, and justice required no courts or weapons to enforce it. Astrea was said to be radiant in her beauty, but her radiance was more than skin deep, for it was the glow of integrity, the light of fairness, the purity of a world untainted by cruelty. Mortals revered her not as a distant divinity, but as a companion, one who lived among them, teaching them the value of balance, honesty, and compassion. But the Golden Age did not last. As time pressed forward into the Silver and then the Bronze Age, humanity grew restless and corrupt, their hearts clouded by ambition, violence, and the thirst for power. Where once Astrea could move freely among villages without fear, now she watched men cheat one another, watched justice give way to greed, and watched peace dissolve into bloodshed. The world grew loud with the clash of weapons, and heavy with deceit, and Astrea, who had been the last of the immortals, to endure among mortals, found herself alone in a land that no longer reflected the virtues she cherished. One by one the other gods had fled Olympus' children, retreating to the heavens or the seas, unwilling to linger among the failings of mankind. And at last, even Astrea could no longer bear it. With sorrow, she lifted her eyes to the sky and abandoned the earth she had once loved. Her departure, a silent judgment on the corruption of the human race. Yet, though she withdrew, she was not erased. For Zeus placed her in the heavens as the constellation Virgo, fixing her figure eternally among the stars. To the ancients who gazed upward, Virgo was not merely a maiden with a sheaf of grain in her hand, but the eternal reminder of what had been lost when humanity abandoned justice and the hope that one day such purity might return. Her constellation shone each year during the season of harvest, linking her not only with moral order, but with the abundance of the fields, as though to remind mortals that fairness and fertility were intertwined, that without justice, society could not flourish, just as without grain, no city could endure. In Astrea's sorrowful ascension lay both warning and promise, a warning of what corruption would cost, and a promise that the ideals of justice and truth, though absent from the world, still lived above, eternal and unchanging in the stars. Among the countless points of light that form the constellation Virgo, there is one that has always commanded special reverence: Spica, a star whose name means ear of grain, shining like a golden seed against the velvet night. To the ancients, Spica was far more than a brilliant beacon in the sky, was the celestial embodiment of balance, nourishment, and the fragile order upon which every society depended. If Astrea herself was remembered as the maiden of justice, who could no longer endure the corruption of humankind, then Spica became her lasting gift, a reminder that fairness and sustenance were bound together, that the order of a city and the fertility of the fields were not separate concerns, but two halves of the same truth. Just as justice sustained the harmony of human life, grain sustained the body, and in Spica's light, the two were forever joined. The rising of Spica each year carried deep meaning. Farmers watched the star as a signal of harvest, its gleam telling them when to gather the wheat and barley that stood between abundance and famine. But in the temples and courts, its symbolism reached further. For Spica also became a sign of fairness, of the careful balance needed to distribute that harvest, so that no one was left to starve, while others feasted. In its single gleaming light, the ancients saw the principle that food was not merely a commodity, but a foundation of justice, that the survival of the many depended upon the equity with which the fruits of the earth were shared. The star's brilliance was both practical and moral. Practical because it guided the timing of the harvest. Moral because it reminded leaders and citizens alike that the true wealth of a community lay not in gold or conquest, but in its ability to sustain all who lived within it. Thus, Spekka became a symbol of the delicate balance upon which human life rests. It was not the brilliance of victory or the roar of conquest, but the quiet assurance that order and fairness must govern both field and forum. To betray justice was to risk disorder. To neglect the harvest was to invite hunger. But to honor both was to ensure survival, peace, and prosperity. In this way, Virgo's brightest star was a constant reminder that the great ideals Astrea had embodied were not lofty dreams removed from the world, but necessities tied to the grain in the field, the bread on the table, and the fairness in the marketplace. Each time Spekka appeared in the sky, it was as though the heavens themselves were offering a lesson, that the well-being of a society is measured not in monuments or victories, but in weather. Its people are fed, treated with fairness, and allowed to live in balance with one another. When the ancients lifted their eyes to Virgo, they did not see a figure of idle beauty drifting silently through the heavens, but a reminder of the values upon which both their survival and their dignity depended. For the constellation was at once the image of Astrea, the maiden of justice, and the eternal emblem of agriculture's bounty, a union of ideals that bound morality and sustenance into a single celestial form. To them, Virgo's wide stretch across the night sky spoke of honesty in human dealings, the fairness required to keep the fragile bonds of community intact, and the abundance of the harvest that rewarded patience, labor, and devotion to the land. No myth existed in isolation. Every constellation was both story and guide. And in Virgo they found a tale that bridged the worlds of gods and mortals, teaching that the measure of justice was as practical as the weight of grain, and that the purity of truth was as nourishing as the bread placed on the table. Virgo's association with Astrea reminded people of a time when honesty had ruled the earth, when words were trusted and contracts required no oaths, when fairness lived not in courts, but in the daily dealings between neighbors. To see her figure among the stars was to feel both the loss of that age and the yearning to reclaim it, to live once more in a world where integrity was as common as the soil beneath their feet. Yet at the same time, Virgo was tied to the rhythms of agriculture, her presence in the sky marking the turning of the seasons, her brightest star, Spekka, shining as a sign that the fields were ready to yield their gifts. The constellation's dual role, maiden of justice, guardian of grain, was not a contradiction, but a harmony. For the ancients understood that morality and sustenance were inseparable. A corrupt society would squander its abundance, while a just one could make even meager harvests endure. In this way, Virgo stood as one of the most vital constellations of the zodiac, not dazzling with drama like Leo, or dark tragedy like Scorpio, but offering instead the assurance that honesty, fairness, and fruitful labor formed the bedrock of civilization. To ignore her lessons was to invite famine and discord, but to honor them was to secure peace and plenty. And so each year when Virgo rose high in the heavens, stretching her figure across the harvest skies, the ancients saw more than a cluster of stars. They saw a celestial covenant, a reminder that justice is not an abstraction, but the very seed from which abundance grows, and that only through honesty and fairness can societies nourish both body and spirit. Where Virgo stretched across the heavens as the maiden of justice and abundance, Libra followed with the stark simplicity of a symbol that needed no body, no beast, no heroic tale of blood and sacrifice to declare its meaning. Instead, the ancients fixed in the sky the image of a pair of scales, the only inanimate figure in the zodiac, and in that choice lay profound significance. Libra represented the principle that underpinned not only law and governance, but also the rhythms of survival, balance, fairness, and the careful measure that turns chaos into order. To gaze upon Libra was to be reminded that life itself depends on weight and proportion, grain measured out honestly in the market, goods divided without deceit, justice dispensed without bias, seasons counted with precision so that the sowing and the reaping might arrive at their proper times. In the simple form of the scales, the ancients found a cosmic emblem of equilibrium. the truth that neither man nor earth can thrive when tilted toward excess or neglect. The timing of Libra's appearance deepened its meaning, for its rising coincided with the autumn equinox, the moment when day and night stood in perfect equality, a cosmic mirror of the scales themselves. To those who looked upward, this was no coincidence, but a divine lesson written in light, that just as the heavens held balance, so too must human life seek it between rich and poor, justice and mercy, work and rest, consumption and restraint. Farmers saw in Libra the necessity of fair division at harvest, ensuring that the abundance of the fields was measured properly and distributed wisely. Merchants invoked it as a reminder that dishonest weights and rigged scales would not only cheat their neighbors, but offend the gods themselves. Judges and rulers saw in its symmetry the reflection of their duty to govern impartially, to keep their societies upright by preventing the scales of justice from tipping too far to one side. Thus Libra stood as more than a constellation. It was a principle elevated into the sky, a promise that fairness was not merely a human invention but a cosmic order that the stars themselves upheld. Where other zodiac signs told stories of daring escapes, divine seductions, or monstrous struggles, Libra offered a quieter but no less profound truth: that balance sustains life, that fairness protects community, and that the harvest, whether of fields or of deeds, must always be measured with honesty. Its stars shone not with the roar of lions or the gleam of golden fleece, but with the calm assurance that equilibrium is sacred, that justice is eternal, and that the scales will always wait to weigh what humanity places upon them. Though the Greeks would later weave Libra into their vision of cosmic harmony, and the Romans would embrace it as the celestial emblem of justice, the story of the scales began much earlier, in the cradle of civilization, along the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. It was there, among the Babylonians, that the idea of weighing and measuring was first lifted into the heavens. For to a people whose survival depended on the cycles of the Tigris and Euphrates, balance was not a philosophical abstraction but a daily necessity. Floods could nourish or destroy, harvests could sustain or starve, and so the concept of scales became sacred, a divine assurance that the universe itself held order, measuring out fortune and calamity in equal turn. The Babylonians, careful observers of the skies, embedded this principle into their constellations, shaping the stars into the likeness of balance, long before the Romans would see in them the symbol of justice that would preside over courts and laws. As this vision traveled westward, it transformed, yet never lost its essence. The Greeks, ever eager to tie celestial forms to their myths of gods and heroes, hesitated to fix meaning in something so inanimate, for their imagination thrived on figures of beasts and mortals. Yet when the Romans inherited the Zodiac, they recognized the quiet power of Libra, and in its measured symmetry, they saw the perfect reflection of their ideals of law and governance. To them the scales became not only a seasonal marker tied to the equinox when day and night stood in equal measure, but also a cosmic emblem of justice itself, impartial and unyielding, an eternal reminder that the rule of law must weigh all people with fairness. In Rome, courts and forums, the image of the scales was carved into stone, painted on walls, invoked by magistrates, and embodied by goddesses like Justitia, whose hands held Libra aloft as a sign that equity was the foundation of empire. Thus, from the fertile fields of Babylon to the marble halls of Rome, Libra's meaning endured, reshaped, yet always grounded in the same truth that survival and society alike demand balance. What had once been a symbol of measured harvests and cosmic order became, under Roman hands, the very image of justice, the moral weight that sustains civilization. And when the constellation gleamed at the time of the equinox, it seemed to affirm that this was no human invention but a divine decree written in the stars, that fairness was eternal, balance was sacred, and justice would always find its measure. What Libra ultimately came to embody was not a story of conquest or divine passion but something far more enduring: the assurance that equity, law, and fair division stood at the very heart of human survival, and that these ideals were mirrored in the heavens themselves. When the scales rose at the time of the autumn equinox, the ancients saw more than just a constellation. They saw the balance of the cosmos reflected in the balance of their own lives, day and night standing as equals, just as grain and labor, wealth and need must be held in fair proportion. This moment of perfect symmetry was not merely an astronomical event, but a lesson inscribed in light, reminding rulers to govern without bias, merchants to measure with honesty, and farmers to divide their harvests with justice so that all might endure the turning of the seasons together. In societies where famine and abundance hung on the edge of the same blade, Libra's symbolism was inseparable from the rhythms of survival. The scales reminded every market stall and granary that to tip them dishonestly was not only to cheat a neighbor, but to upset the sacred balance upon which all depended. Law itself, in the Roman imagination, took its shape from this vision. Just as the equinox held the day and night in harmony, so too must justice weigh every man and woman with impartial care, punishing and rewarding not according to power or favor, but according to truth. The goddess who carried the scales was not merely a guardian of courts, but a cosmic custodian, ensuring that the distribution of food, wealth, and even mercy followed the order of the heavens. Thus Libra's stars shone with a calm authority, unlike the fiery blaze of Leo or the tragic sorrow of Virgo, offering instead a reminder that the strength of a society is not tested only on the battlefield, but in the marketplace, the fields, and the courts, where fairness determines whether abundance becomes prosperity or discord. In this way, Libra stood eternal as the constellation of balance, its scales forever poised at the center of the sky, whispering that the survival of humanity depends not on force or cunning alone, but on the timeless principles of equity, justice, and fair measure. Beyond its serene presence in the heavens, Libra carried a dual legacy that touched every part of ancient life. For it was not a constellation, admired only for its beauty or symbolic weight, but one that served both practical and moral purposes, binding together the physical needs of society with the higher ideals that sustained its order. On the one hand, its rising and setting were tools for navigation and farming, guiding sailors across treacherous seas and telling farmers when to sow, reap, and prepare for the long months ahead. The equinox, marked by Libra's balance of day and night, offered a calendar written in starlight, a reassurance that the cosmos itself provided a rhythm to follow, a rhythm upon which survival depended. Yet at the same time, the scales were not merely instruments of measurement in fields or markets, but emblems of morality, reminding humanity that justice, honesty, and fairness were as essential to life as the harvest itself. This blending of the practical and the ethical was what made Libra so unique among the constellations. A farmer might gaze upward and see in its stars the sign that his crops were ready for gathering, just as a magistrate might look to the same stars and recall his duty to weigh disputes with impartiality. A merchant at his stall might place his goods on physical scales, but overhead, the eternal balance of Libra reminded him that dishonesty in measure was not only a crime against his neighbor, but a disruption of cosmic harmony. And a sailor steering by the stars could find direction in Libra's placement, just as his people sought direction in the justice and order that the constellation symbolized on land. The scales became both compass and creed, charting paths across seas and within societies alike. In this way, Libra transcended the boundaries of myth to become a living guide, a constellation that was not content to tell a story of divine struggle, but instead offered a principle of balance that shaped human behavior in every sphere. Its dual purpose underscored a truth the ancients never forgot, that survival is built on two pillars, the material and the moral, and that without one the other collapses. Crops could feed a people for a season, but only fairness could hold a society together across generations. Libra's enduring glow across the autumn sky was therefore both a calendar and a covenant, a reminder that navigation and farming, law and justice, were all measured by the same eternal scales. As the journey through these constellations draws to a close, we are left with an understanding far deeper than the surface glitter of stars. For what at first might appear to be nothing more than scattered lights in the night sky reveals itself, upon closer reflection, to be a tapestry woven with threads of human struggle, divine intervention, and the eternal search for meaning. The zodiac, often simplified today into horoscopes and personality traits, was never intended to be a shallow guide to fortune. It was born from ancient attempts to explain the mysteries of life and the movements of time itself, rooted first in Babylonian observation, and then reshaped by the Greeks into myths that spoke not only of gods and heroes, but of the very essence of what it means to endure, to sacrifice, and to hope. Each constellation carried more than a picture, it carried a story that reached across centuries, reminding those who gazed upon it that their lives were part of something much larger than themselves. Aries was not simply a ram in the heavens, but the memory of rescue, purchased at great cost, its golden fleece becoming the spark for quests and adventures that would inspire generations. Taurus was more than Zeus's disguise. It embodied the raw power of fertility, the mystery of seasonal change, and the fertile soil upon which civilizations depended. Gemini's stars shone with the devotion of Castor and Pollux, the twins who refused to be parted even by death, offering mortals a model of loyalty that transcended blood and battlefield alike. Cancer, dim yet enduring, was the eternal reminder that quiet service and steady labor could be as heroic as any conquest, that patience and resilience are their own kind of courage. Then came Leo, whose blazing form immortalized not just the monstrous lion, but the very idea of strength tested against the impossible. The lion's impenetrable hide became a symbol of trials that could only be overcome through determination, and Heracles, in wearing its pelt, showed how even the fiercest obstacles could be transformed into protection and power. Virgo followed with gentler, more sorrowful lessons, her figure tied to Astraea, the maiden of justice who departed a corrupt world, leaving behind the promise of fairness embodied in Spica's golden glow. Her constellation reminded mortals that abundance and honesty were intertwined, that without justice even the richest harvest would wither into discord. And then Libra rose in balance, the only inanimate sign of the zodiac, yet one of the most profound. Its scales symbolized both the practical and the moral. They weighed grain in the marketplace, guided navigation and farming by the equinox, and at the same time stood as a sacred emblem of equity, fairness, and law, emerging first in Babylon and later absorbed by the Romans. Libra bridged the realms of survival and justice, reminding every merchant, every farmer, every judge that balance was not merely a human invention, but a cosmic truth, written into the heavens themselves. When we see these constellations today, scattered like ancient fires across the dark, we are not only looking at distant suns, but at the shared inheritance of humanity, the stories through which our ancestors sought to understand life's hardest questions. Why must we suffer? What does it mean to sacrifice? And how can order be preserved in a world so often filled with chaos? These myths endure because they are not truly about the stars. They are about us, about the eternal struggles and triumphs that mark every age. The zodiac was never just a series of symbols, it was a mirror of the human condition, reflecting our fears, our hopes, and our unending desire to believe that in the vastness of the universe, our struggles, too, are remembered. And so, as you drift towards sleep, may these ancient stories settle around you like constellations of the mind, reminding you that even in darkness there is meaning, that even faint lights hold lessons, and that the sky above us has always whispered the same truth. We are part of something greater, something eternal, something written in the stars. Good night, and may your dreams be as endless and timeless as the heavens themselves.